Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of Don't Die. This time, here's the second half of my Q&A with Jesper Juul, who is a video game theorist out in Copenhagen. He and I spoke on December 4th, 2017, and if you'd like to read transcripts of other interviews I've done, please check the links down below or go over to nodon'tdie.com. Also, you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue with this work that I'm doing. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and here's Jesper Juul. A little bit about how, sometimes just legitimately the history of games is kind of tricky to trace. And I know we had also emailed about just sort of media and critics not having necessarily like a firm or the best grasp or most extensive grasp of history in games. I mean, do you feel that there is a damage that is done when we wind up just having conversations that are just circular without realizing that they're circular in the media or wherever they ripple out to?
It's interesting. Yeah, I guess I mean, it's true, and I guess it's even by now kind of old-fashioned idea. This idea that you want to have criticism that positions the work historically, like a more kind of traditional art criticism. But I do think it's true we never really had that. I mean, there was this idea of new games journalism that was much more kind of personal, kind of experiential. But it's true I
Yeah.
never really saw the kind of game criticism that talks that seriously about how a game fits into video game history. And I
Mm-hmm.
always thought that was kind of sad, right? That in a way there's a lot of history that's lost, or even people don't even have the language for talking about what's going on, either as
Yeah.
players or as developers. But I guess the other thing is that, so as I'm an academic, right? So some of the first stuff I wrote about was, say, games and stories. And then some years pass, and then you have all these like young PhDs writing about games and stories, or whatever, or trying to get back into kind of what I thought was settled discussions about games. But when I think of it that way, I also think that, especially if you've been around in the field for a while, you also just have to accept that discussions kind of come back, and that you didn't actually close them even though you thought they did. But then also, like, old discussions do kind of come back, but then they mean something slightly different than they did before.
Yeah.
Because
They're revisited rather than
yeah, and they
rehashed.
have acquire a new meaning. So I think it's always just wrong to think that because, well, I was there, so I saw it. And I think I mean, you see it with VR. And I know some people who, like, they were, and VR was all this hype thing. It didn't amount to anything. So therefore, VR now is just hyped and won't amount to anything. But perhaps it's different, right?
Yeah.
You can't actually, these historical parallels don't necessarily work that well. Or things do change, even if it sounds the same sometimes.
So was this I don't know that I necessarily know this. I mean, was this split of casual and hardcore, was that an echo of something that came before?
Well, I mean, so the way I tell it in the book is more that I think it's more of a something that was repressed in a way, that
Oh yeah. No, I would
yeah,
agree.
that in a way, like, the early video games had to be made for a general population because there was no gamer population, right? That there was no audience which had an intimate knowledge of video game conventions, because there weren't a lot of video game conventions in the first place. Right, and so that's something that kind of develops over time from the, like, 80s through the 90s, that you get, it becomes more and more specialized. And in a way, I think that's a good thing, right? You get all this kind of interesting stuff that requires you to know all these previous games. You can build on them. You don't have to teach everything every time, but that also made them inaccessible just to a large portion of the population. And so then I think that's, and this is just something that in a way, the industry just became completely certain that the only games they could make were these kind of very large, expensive games in boxes, which were usually or almost exclusively sold to kind of younger men and boys. And so in the book, I have
Right.
interviews with several people, including, like, Margaret Wallace, who was working on cats and dogs, these simulator
Yeah.
games. And talking about like even once they had the demographic data of the players, they just couldn't believe it in the company, or couldn't grok the idea that they were also catering to an older or more or catering an older audience, or catering more to women than they expected. So I think that just shut out a lot of people for a long period of time. And then, I mean, you had smaller games like Microsoft Solitaire being around, but I think then in the 2000s, it suddenly kind of came back, like because you had new distribution models, you could actually sell smaller games again, and then you could actually make games
Yeah.
for that large audience, which kind of had been forgotten for such a long time.
It's funny that you mentioned that because you reminded me of another interview I did where I was being told about the GDC the year that Myst came out, and how even though it was a huge, huge smash
Mm,
hit, there was this sort of entrenched denial or dismissal from many in
yeah.
the industry that either it wasn't as popular as people said it was, or it was a fluke, or that, I mean, basically, a lot of the reporting that you see from the ESA these days about a lot of things is sort of the way they were writing off the way Myst was being talked about. So, I mean, do you think is that? I mean, are there things that you see like an entrenched denial of similarly today in the industry, whether it's trends for releases or things happening in the culture, or I mean, do you see a repetition on that theme still playing out today?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think well, there's a a denial of microtransactions, I guess. So it's still this thing that people just kind of seem to get a lot of feeling of identity from saying that microtransactions are stupid and exploitative and all this kind of stuff. And it is kind of weird disconnect, both in a financial sense. It's clearly where a lot of money is, even if it goes wrong sometimes, as with Battlefront 2, but also just in a kind of
Right.
concrete sense, like why do you think people are playing those games in the first place? And there's a lot of reasons for it. Like one of them is that unless you're kind of following kind of releases well, unless you're easily swayed by television advertising, it's kind of hard to know what game you want to pay for, right? And so that's also what I talked
Right.
about with kind of downloadable casual games. They or started using in a way what you could see as a kind of shareware model, where you in a way get the game, but you can only play for an hour, and then you could decide whether you want to
Mm-hmm.
play. And so that just changes the equation for people who just aren't following it, or don't necessarily know upfront what they want to pay for. And of course, it's just more interesting to pay for something, or you're more likely to pay for something once you know the value. And I think the same thing with microtransactions, right? So why am I paying for a chest so I can get a legendary card? Well, it's because the legendary card is actually really valuable to me now, because I played the game for a year, right? And it just wasn't valuable before I started playing. So there's a reason why people like this stuff. And I think most of the time that's just people just completely in complete denial about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that word exploitive gets thrown around a lot, but something I don't even think I mentioned I did this because it's become such a major through line of this, but I do a lot of interviewing around labor in
Mm,
games and just sort of what working conditions are like and what media awareness is like and what media doesn't write about, what fans aren't aware of. Um, it's funny because you will hear fans talk about games being exploitive to them, and yet I guess the question is why do you think there's so little compassion or concern about exploitation actually playing out for the people making the things that they're consuming? Like that seems to be one constant that has been around since the beginning of
mm.
games. Certainly, there was a flare up with EA Spouse, but I bet you that's not a household
Yeah.
term that the average person would know. So why do you think that
Oh, it's
persists?
interesting. Yeah, I would guess it probably goes. I mean, games just have this weird history of being kind of kind of these kind of technological things, while they're also kind of art in a way, but they do tend to be approached sometimes as if they were washing machines, right? So I think there's a tendency for people, in the same way that you'd be kind of complain about your dishwasher, your washing machine, as far being broken. I think people tend to take the kind of same kind of practical utilitarian approach to games sometimes. And so like if the washing machine doesn't wash correctly, I think you're right to complain. But for games, I think it's a slightly different thing. It just seems people kind of sometimes think that all of the problems they see in a way were just like obviously easily solvable, and people don't
Right.
people just don't. I think regular people don't have any idea how complex it is to make a video game.
I think
Sorry.
no, no, you
So I was
are.
talking to Rami Ismail from Flambeer,
Yeah.
and he also talked about. I asked him why he was doing. They were doing the open development process of Nuclear Throne, and he said one of the reasons for them was just so people would understand how much time was involved, that they couldn't just like press a button and add a feature. And I do think that that is part of the problem, right? That now you have so many games and people just kind of expect that whatever they want should just be easily kind of put in there with a flick of a switch. And
Yeah, I think it's true of all creative endeavors now. I don't know if it's post internet or what, but there does seem to be this, just this hive mind of, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that? It's so easy.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And just because people like back them up, they're like, yeah, it is easy. They're like, well, you're not doing it, so I guess it's this vicious cycle. It's another vicious cycle of like, well, they're not, I'm not going to give them my money because they're not making the game I want. For some reason, they're making the game they want,
Yeah, the game that they
which is weird. You've used the word weird many times. I think that's the first time I've used
yeah.
that, but I think that's a thing that's weird.
But
Um,
but it also goes to
oh, go
the
ahead.
kind of money question, right? That I mean, so I guess also perhaps there's this perception that there's so much money in video games that well you don't need to pay. And I guess I remember that even from when I was a kid, like piracy was okay, you weren't going to pay for it anyway, and perhaps they were kind of rich, didn't matter, right? So you said video game developers at least historically weren't kind of humanized in the same way that other kind of creative developers were, or like people in other art forms were, and so that always made the kind of money thing harder. And I think you'd say that I guess one of the things with independent games is that there's much more of a focus on the creator. So there's much more of this. Anyway, they promoted much more on this idea of being a game that someone has made. So at least in theory, that should make players more kind of open to the idea that these people actually needed to get paid. But of course, they also end up in kind of at the end of various kind of hate storms anyway.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of a window into something I wanted to talk about, which is I remember there being a lot of. I mean, I covered the GDC the year that sort of casual became this term people started using, and I know at least they talked about it. I remember a response on the internet being again very dismissive. I mean, is it an overstatement to say this or to ask this? I mean, do you see things like the hate against casual as sort of a forerunner to things like Gamergate?
It's yeah, it's well, it's similar in certain ways, right? So it's similar in that there was a particular kind of game, or like what I usually call it like the the standard model, like I say like 1980 to 2005. A game was something you bought in a box. It was kind of very involved, and it would have like ever more kind of realistic graphics, and so that people feel that that model was being challenged or threatened with the arrival of casual games. And I think you would say that
Right.
in a way the yeah, if we want to make kind of assumptions about the psychological profile of of say a game mogator, for example, so at least it seems to be something similar, or at least there's something similar expressed that their game is under attack, but perhaps by different
Yeah.
kinds of forces in this case. So it does seem to be yeah. There's a lot of kind of defensiveness in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I sort of connect all that in something you mentioned before, which is the congressional stuff, out in America. Which I mean, what is sort of the gaming industry's role when these sort of
Hmm.
firestorms, no matter how mainstream they might seem, break out? I mean, I always had sensed like the industry came out full force in those congressional things and learned some sort of lesson from it that they don't participate when things like, I mean, Gamergate is a very extreme example because you have people literally threatening to, kill each other over these products. The casual stuff was more just general, I guess what we would have called like flame wars. Um, but do you think it's ridiculous to sort of connect those three? Do you think that the industry should be doing more to sort of directly, explicitly send a message?
Well, it's a great question, actually. But I do think that there's certainly the similarities in a way are pretty strong in at least some of the language that was being in use. I'm not sure about the kind of threats and so on, but
Yeah.
people, and I also quoted in the book, a lot of people were very upset even just by the existence of casual games, and felt that their kind of favorite medium was kind of being destroyed or watered down. And actually, I quote one person who talks about, feels that it's a kind of blasphemy to make video games kind of accessible, which is kind of interesting. What's the industry's role? It's super interesting. I think to the extent that the video game industry could actually say something. So if it actually would change something, or if you could actually make people understand that these are games made by people, and some of these decisions aren't easy, and so on, to humanize that. I think it's true. If the industry could like work towards that might be a thing. But of course, you could say that the way video games are promoted, or large video games are promoted as anonymous products, kind of breaks that, right? Because in a way, EA or Activision Blizzard want to be these kind of gigantic, efficient corporations. But that also, in a way, hinges on this idea that they make products which are completely anonymous. Most people really don't know who made them, and that makes it kind of it's dehumanized from the beginning, I guess. Yeah, it's like it's a super interesting question. I don't really have any good kind of solutions. I mean, if the industry could do something, okay. I think that would be great.
I didn't think we were going to solve anything here. I think it's just interesting to hear about. I mean, it's funny because I was asked a version of this question by someone who described herself. She predominantly plays Facebook games, and I mean, is if we're going to sort of indulge these hardcore versus casual divisions, I mean, to you, I mean, how does being someone's friend in Farmville, like, how is that any different than, say, doing missions with a stranger in the Division? Like, is there really much of a difference?
Yeah, well, of course, as you put it, it's in ways it's obviously the same thing, but I guess the Division just has a certain kind of things it signals, right, in terms of like content and violence and so on, that just kind of differentiates itself, and also perhaps in terms of, you can say, like the upfront time it takes to get into a game like that, or to kind of perform at a kind of sufficient level that you're kind of very serious gamer friends will actually take you seriously. So I think that kind of makes it different. Yeah, but of course it goes both ways. I think a lot of people who play Farmville, or at least perhaps like Heyday today, just wouldn't actually be touching the kind of the Division or Destiny 2 or something like that. So I do think I do think it goes both ways. But I mean, these little signals actually mean something, right? So a lot of top hits have a kind of similar. You always have this kind of have similar beats, and you might have similar chords, but things like who the performer is, or how they dress, is certainly gonna play a huge role in people's decisions about what they're actually gonna listen to, right? So just our identities are very much tied into what we kind of consume or listen to, and as I said, I think it's just becoming the same with games, because you now get such a large range of games you can choose to play.
Mm-hmm. And I know, I think you just published a paper on this, and you just brought up marketing, but I mean, are there ways you personally wish marketing for games is different, or was different?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that I do think you say if there's one problem with say mainstream AAA, is this weird relation to technology. So I'm not against. I do have a PlayStation 4, though not the Xbox One. I do like new graphics and so on, but I do also think that it's how the industry kind of keeps pinning itself into a corner if the main selling point, or like one of the kind of strongest upfront selling points, is like how great things look in a in this kind of weird technical sense, right? So that it's always about like getting better reflections in the water or having more detailed models, and it's just very counterproductive, right? It just means you're always pushing up the budgets, and you're also always ending up spending a lot of time on things that at least perhaps don't matter that much. Once you play it for a few hours, you cease to see the great textures and so on. And so that just seems to be a kind of unproductive kind of way of promoting games. And I guess it's just in a way, but it's kind of arms race that kind of always happens in games. But it happens for mainstream AAA. It also happened for downloadable casual games for a while, that you started having these kind of competitions in production value. And so it became much kind of the budget for these supposedly small games just kept going up and up. And so I do think that's a problem. But they don't really know like how, it's just people don't necessarily know that well how to promote games and other, or especially not consoles and on other kind of criteria. And it's only kind of Nintendo still that's kind of trying to do anything kind of different.
Well, yeah, as they always have,
Yeah.
more or less. I'd be fascinated. I don't know how much time you actually spent with older players. I know that you had some interviews in your books with. I mean, from what you've gleaned, I mean, talking to people from that demographic, from the elderly, I mean, what seems to be important in video games? Like, what trends did they notice and comment on?
I mean, so the people I talked to, so a lot of them mentioned things like they had something they felt very strongly against violence in games. So a lot of the people they really didn't like that, and also the time wasn't, accessibility was an issue, and so they probably kind of really wouldn't buy a console. So when I was interviewing people, this was much more like people playing on the PCs. So I don't think it's harder for them to imagine that they would buy dedicated game hardware at the time. So the people who are playing the Wii were usually doing this like in public spaces or with kind of family. And so those things, and then also perhaps like kind of the connection to kind of existing media properties or existing types of games actually mattered a lot. So I talked to a woman who was playing lots of kind of hidden object games, and just saw those as a continuation of say like kind of all the kind of ladies magazines that she used to read, which had this like say like a mystery page or with like a puzzle page. So to her that was the connection, that was the tradition those games were part of. She didn't see what she was doing as being part of like a tradition that involved Doom or even Myst. Right? This was not at all how she thought about it.
Well, I mean, you said in the book, which was 7 years ago, that it seems like the image of gamers as predominantly young men is a thing of the past, and obviously in the years since we've had some internet flare-ups that have seen either the death throes of that notion or something. I mean, what do you feel sort of is the image of a gamer today? I mean, is it that old image? Has it come back, or has it never gone away, or where do you feel?
Well, I mean, so we should distinguish between the word gamer and people who play video games.
Yeah, I don't even like.
Right. So it's a bit like so as a roundabout kind of answer. So I remember like it used to be there was this question like say you had all these like big rock bands like Rolling Stones or something, and then you had this guy, could they keep playing this young men's music once they got old, right? And then you realize, well, they could keep playing the music, but it just became old man's music over time, all this like this rock and roll, right? So it's just that the word just changed, and I think the same thing with gamer. So I think at this time when I was writing the book, I just thought perhaps that we would just expand the notion of gamer or game player. But what happened, I think, instead was just that it broke up into pieces, right? So there's if people use the word gamer, they're probably usually referring to someone who's playing kind of console or possibly PC games. And then that just is a different word than people, and we have the usual prejudices, I think, against those as a kind of young, unkempt men who spend too much time, don't have friends, and so on. At least to some extent, right? At least if you're playing, this is no idea of playing too much. And then you have this like larger notion of people who play video games or digital games and so on, which I think is just a much broader. I think it's understood by everyone to be a much broader demographic.
What do you think both those groups, as arbitrary and nebulous as they are, what do you think they misunderstand about the other?
Well, so I think I like to have this idea of that there are three groups, right? There's there's the mainstream gamers, and then you have the casual gamers, and then you have the indie gamers. And so I was referring to this earlier. So they each have these kind of things they don't like about the others. So I would say that that's the thing I'd say. The mainstream AAA gamers, yeah, I think the indie games are just too strange and artsy fartsy for their own sake, and then that the casual games aren't kind of real games and not challenging. Indie gamers think that mainstream AAA is just kind of too violent and too shallow, but that casual games are also too shallow but not too violent. And casual gamers think that mainstream games are just too violent and too large, too time intensive, but that indie games are just too kind of, again, impenetrable or too artsy in a way. So those would be like, if you have kind of three groups that don't kind of like each other. But again, also I think it's a bit like a lot of these, some of it is also just this kind of identity thing. Like, I'm not even sure. I mean, it used to be like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Mozart and Beethoven, I think, or Justin Bieber versus One Direction or whatever. I'm not sure what the latest one is. So sometimes you have disagreements about things because they're kind of too similar, right, rather than too different. So perhaps, as you said, like, yeah, playing with someone in Heyday may not be too different than playing with someone in Destiny, and in a way that's why people get so upset, right? Because they're actually kind of similar, and then they make up differences as a way of kind of defining their own identity.
Well, as someone who also makes games, I mean, what do you think all those different audiences don't understand about the work that goes into them?
Yeah, I guess ideally you could say like indie games probably hopefully on in the big picture is the one where there's the closest best understanding of the work that goes into making a game, but that's in a way also kind of part of the kind of, I'm not sure, I wouldn't say ethics, or at least the way independent games are promoted as being this kind of personal, and you want to learn about the struggle, about how the developers lived on ramen or slept at the university and so on. So I think you get more of this kind of struggling artist story in indie games. And then I think both for casual and for AAA, I don't think it's just sort of too vague for people how these things get made. And I think often developers go out of the way to make these become like anonymous products. Like you don't really have, it may even be hard to get to the credit screen to figure out who made these things. Right, you may have to complete the game, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes,
right. I mean, although you do play some games now and they have the credits at the very beginning on the menu. Well, I mean, I've asked you a lot about things that obviously confound or fascinate me, or I'm curious about with both internet culture and game culture and the way they overlap. I mean, is there something that has surprised you, or that you think about, or that confounds you about the way that these different cultures have, overlapped and coalesced and are congealing? Sort of, the things that people say to each other, or what they're talking about, or the way that they talk about it.
Well, I think. And this is where I think it would be nice to have more historical criticism. I think people always kind of overestimate the naturalness of what they grow up with. I think this is sometimes called the shifting baseline syndrome. This thing that whatever happened when you were a kid just feels kind of natural to you. So then that whatever, you said like people may have a peak around 12 years, and I think this is pretty kind of common, and they assume that's kind of the natural state of things, and everything else is kind of a fall from grace. And I do think that, and again, I think people especially overestimate the kind of perfection of that standard model where you buy a game in a box. So I'll usually make the case that a lot of those games actually were pretty boring once you got past the beginning, right? Because all of the money went into making a great intro and perhaps a tutorial, and then like the very first beginning of playing, because that's like what people might be seeing in the store or at their friend, and then perhaps the end, because that kind of gives journalists to write something to write about in their articles. But I think a lot of single player experiences, especially like this, are very boring in the middle, because there's no incentive to actually spend a lot of time making that great. And so I think just people completely fail to realize that model has its own kind of skews and distortions, like it's also a business model, right? And the people think that just free to play is some kind of perverted business model, but all business models do something. They all have a kind of skew, and I think people. I'm kind of disappointed that people just don't see that at all.
Well, this is kind of maybe possibly down note to end on then, but this is something I ask of everyone, but you can turn however you want. What do you think video games have accomplished?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I do think I do believe in some of the, what you can call it, more kind of lofty ideas of video games, that in a way they are a kind of form that speaks to our time in a very general sense, even though I think that can be a weird thing to say. Not necessarily just because they're complex systems, the world is full of complex systems, etc., but perhaps a bit more because they, in a way, try to take the interfaces that we use every day and try to make them into something, you can say, poetic, right? So say we have this button. So what about if we make a game which, in a way, we create a kind of entertainment experience around pressing that button, or try to make button pressing something into something that's kind of meaningful and kind of deep. And I think you see this very concretely if you play in a game on a mobile phone, right? You have your mobile phone, you're constantly clicking and pressing it and doing all this kind of manipulation stuff. And then you switch to a different app, and then suddenly you're also doing kind of similar things. Your fingers are flying around it, but now that thing has been transformed into something you kind of do for kind of fun or for the experience of it. And I think that's actually pretty interesting. I don't think people kind of appreciate how games kind of do that. They take these kind of basic actions that we perform with our electronic devices, and then they kind of transform them into something else, transform them into kind of experiences, which kind of hopefully get us to think about what our everyday interaction with our phone or interfaces are.